So hello and welcome, and thanks for coming. I'm Mark Lewis. I'm the president of the board, and I am moderating today's event. And before we launch into it, let me just do a little housekeeping. We obviously this current exhibit, I hope you've all already had a chance to look at it. Starchitecture, get it? Which is inspired by the book that the Arts Commission published, written by Craig Walker. Hello, Craig. And if you haven't got a copy, Roger Conroe will be glad to sell you one in the back on your way out. This exhibit will be up through actually October 20th. We have more things in connection with it, and one of them we just scheduled, you should all know, for September 28th, which is a Friday, not a Sunday, because who's going to do it? Raymond Neutra. Raymond is the son of Richard. Richard is the guy that designed that house, which is the Moore House, and another house here, and it's hugely famous mid-century modernist. Raymond is going to be here on the 28th from 5:30 to 7. We'll send you out, those of you who are museum members, will get the usual publicity. And he's going to talk about Neutra and nature. So I'm sure that it'll be very interesting. And the exhibit will be up through the 28th. So we're happy to have you here, and we're happy to be able to have this exhibit inspired by Craig's book, published by the Arts Commission. And today, we have a distinguished panel of architects, all of whom live and work in the Ojai Valley. So let me introduce them, and then we'll start chatting. To begin with, Mark Whitman, who's grown up here. I think most of us in this room knew his dad, the late, great John Whitman, and know his mom, who the distinguished painter who, in fact, the museum honored in this very room, I think 5 years ago, with a career retrospective exhibit. And the Whitman clan in general looms large in Ojai history, and Mark has, I think, spent most of his career as an architect in the valley. Houses, remodels, actual freestanding buildings, gazebos, more than one apparently. I think you're the gazebo king of the Ojai Valley. We'll be getting into that. You all know the one where they have the, in Libby Park, where they have the Wednesday summer concerts, and he just did one at Matilda Junior High School, which matches up with Roy Wilson, who designed the original Nordhoff High School, which is in the book. So it all ties together. Anyway, thank you, Mark. We also have Steve Foster, who is the principal of Cornerstone Architects, and Mark, I think, is a former member of the Planning Commission, and Steve, as is Steve, who was also the chairman of the Planning Commission. And in addition, Steve has designed many buildings, which houses and commercial. Most recently and most prominently, the Topa Mountain Winery is a Steve Foster building. So I think we've all been there and plan to go again. Perhaps later tonight. Also Sunito, and many other places. So part of the built environment is big there. And Ross Anderson, who went to Thatcher School and went on to pursue a career in architecture, and he actually has a firm of which he is the principal, which is headquartered in Tribeca in Manhattan. I think there's a merger on the way that details we can talk about, but and Ross has now set up shop, or I think he is segging towards returning to Ojai. Anyway, he has a house and built a house and some other houses as well in the Ojai Valley. So he is now part of the architecture community here, and we're glad to have him as well. So, with that, let's take up the topic at hand. I'm going to ask all three of these gentlemen what motivated them to become architects. Then we'll move more specifically into Ojai and architecture. So, Ross, since you're immediately to my left, what the heck?
I knew that was going to happen. And this is right.
Yeah.
Why I became an architect? And I'm sure this is something we all share. I like to make things forever, and I went to when I went to college. I took a lot of art and design and mechanical engineering courses at Stanford, and also happened to see, which had just been completed, the Sea Ranch, which was a building, a collection of buildings up the coast north of San Francisco that were very influential. Sort of, I didn't realize how influential at the time. I worked as a carpenter for a year or two after college. I realized I did not want to be a carpenter for the rest of my life. I went to architecture school in Cambridge, and then came back and ended up working for Bill Turnbull, who was in fact the architect or one of the two architects that worked on the Sea Ranch design. So it was sort of an interesting loop for me to start west, go east, come back west, go back east, come back west. Anyway, it's nice to be here.
A little jet lag there. Mark.
It was working?
Can you hear Mark?
Oh, okay, thank you. No, it's not working? Okay, there we go. It was Mr. Gartrell's drafting class at Matilaha Junior High School, and I had an assignment to design a house, and I enjoyed it a lot, and kind of planted a seed in my mind of something that could be possible as a career someday down the road. And I started thinking about that, and started thinking about my strengths and weaknesses, and I was good at math, and also I loved artwork. I was also thinking about being an artist as well. And I started hanging out with Zelma Wilson, going to her office and seeing what architecture was all about, and started, it was about 16 or 17 years old, I said, this is what I want to do.
Zelma Wilson, of course, is designed Meditation Mountain, among other things, and is represented in the book as one of the local heroes, you might say.
Yeah, she was like, I think, the only architect in town at the time. That was in the mid-'70s, around there, and so.
All right, thank you. Steve.
Well, my background's a little different. My grandfather came to the Glendale area down south of us here in the early teens of the last century, and he ended up becoming a masonry contractor from a young man, and worked all these brick buildings. A lot of them are gone now, but in the Glendale area, Pasadena, and so on and so forth. My father picked it up with him, and also at the time I was actually able to work with both of them for a few years before my grandfather retired. So I'm kind of a hands-on guy, if you will. From the time I can remember way back, it was about cement, sand, and making mortar and wheelbarrow and brick around. So it was through that experience in the Pasadena area where I saw these, which I came to learn were green and green homes and things like this, and I'm going, wow, that's pretty cool, and it got me thinking, and as I progressed through my evolution, I actually came to be an architect through contracting, general contracting. And really, one of my influences sitting right next to me here. We built a couple homes together, didn't we, Mark? Back in the been a long time now, but we participated as a team back then. And to the point where I just loved the design so much, I decided to do what it takes to follow through and get that license, and here we are. So.
So the topic today is sort of basically we're teeing off of the current exhibit, which in turn teed off from Craig's book. Craig's book identified 23, somewhat of an arbitrary, 80 pages. There's only so much you can do, but 23 architects and one building per. Some of them have more than one in the valley. Some of them have many in the valley, but most of them are famous. Star architects. The exhibit, I think, encompasses 16, but it's inspired by the book, including, of course, Craig's father, Rodney Walker, who's sort of in that corner of the room. I think there's 7 Rodney Walker houses in the valley, that mid-century modern. Raymond Neutra here, of course, is represented by the Moore House right behind us, and he has another one. Anyway, on and on. I mean, I should consult the book. By the way, full disclosure, I actually was the editor of the book, so I'm pro this book, quite apart from objectivity. Anyway, Craig makes the point, and he has made the point, he's been making this point for years, and he makes a point in the introduction that Ojai, basically due to the town benefactor Edward Libby, is unusual in the sense that Libby, who came from the Midwest and was a magnate, a very rich class magnate, and he was inspired by the City Beautiful movement, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, and he wintered here, as many rich people did in the early part of the last century. But he eventually decided to use architecture to make a better community. And the whole idea was that, in fact, you could use architecture to make a better community. And Craig's point, as he argues in the introduction, persuasively, one might say, is that it worked. But we're here, we'll chat about that, because what he says, for example, that he compares Ojai to Athens under Pericles. Why not? Like Ictinus and Callicrates, who designed the Parthenon for Pericles, an all-star roster of Southern California architects has shaped the valley's built environment, giving it a magnificent collection of buildings rarely seen in a community of its size and distance from the metropolis. So that's kind of the starting point. So, gentlemen, let's kind of get to that. Which you all live here. You've all seen the book. You're all architects. You're just brimming with your opinions. Which of the celebrated books per this book, per the exhibit, more or less in general, do you think are the most? Let's start out with distinguished, because that's not the same thing as your personal favorite. The most important, the most distinguished, the most successful architectural buildings, and we can break this down by type, but let's start with in general. Ross.
These are buildings that I think are important and significant.
Yes, in the valley.
I think the Libby House. I mean, there are all sorts of styles that end up becoming part of this conversation, and whether it's craftsman or Andalusian or Moroccan or Spanish, you sort of need to look through those filters, I think, when you look at some of these buildings. But the Libby House, green and green, certainly the Neutra, we're already spanning now, going from sort of cottage style bungalow on a grand scale to modern.
We should point out that when you say green and green, you're talking about Casa Branca.
Correct.
Which we think of as the
now.
Pratt House, but
Yeah.
it's anyway.
The Libby House that
Hunt and Gray, right?
Hunt and Gray did, I think, is incredibly important and really well maintained. It looks fabulous, as you can see in the photographs. The Maynard Linden schools, that's sort of going a slightly different direction. I mean, they're subtle, and it's all about manipulating light. And he came up with a sort of a device called the Ojai section in his schools, where it was northern light filtered through large industrial sash windows, sloping ceiling, and clear story. And it was a great way of providing sort of filtered natural daylight into schools. And it became, I think he perfected it here in Ojai, but it became sort of a school standard in California.
Yeah, all you boomers, most of you were educated in schools inspired by Miners Oaks Elementary. True.
And then, of course, the Walker House, which I think is incredibly important.
Which Craig grew up in.
Yeah.
Which I think is visible. We aren't projecting anything because we aren't, we want to have a free flowing conversation, but they're images, if you don't happen to have the book, and we are selling them. But beyond that, the images are all around you of the Moore House most prominently, but you can see and the Walker House is over there to the left, and also a little copy of House Beautiful from 1950 something with little Craig, I think, on the cover. Oh, it's so cute. On the cover of House Beautiful, the whole country is looking at Rodney Walker. That wasn't that house. It was the one in, I think, L.A., right? But nonetheless. Anyway, Mark.
I don't think you downplay the significance of our downtown architecture, the Mead-and-Requa, everything they did, and Libby's, amazing contribution to this community. It made Ojai. It wouldn't be anything if it wasn't for him. And the way the design of our downtown corridor is just an amazing, magical little village that they created, which it is who we are. As far as other significant architecture, the Casa Blanca and the Green and Green's contribution to California architecture is unsurpassed. They came up with an invention of their own that was, in their opinion, was California architecture. It was the perfect architecture for our climate and region and a unique design and style that which made the California bungalow world famous.
Well, I'm going to be echoing a lot of what I'm hearing already, because the Pratt House, to me, just looking at it, I'm looking at the picture right now, and aesthetically, you got this organic form just growing out of the ground, the crumbling rock up to the entry, and there's a real connection to the outdoors, and I think that's a common thread we're going to see through a lot of our architecture here in the valley. And because of our climate, as Mark alluded to, it just invites us that natural connection from indoors to outdoors, And so you get this outdoor living sense that starts pretty early. When was that? Early 1900s. Yeah, so that just amazes me to see that. And of course, Mead-and-Requa, they are the ones who forged the style for our downtown area and did it quite nicely. I also like what Carlton Winslow did, with the Presbyterian Church. You have this mission style Spanish thing going on, but it's refined, but it's not over ornamentalized, and it's very clean, and there's something about that just sparkles for me when I see that church. And I think he might have been involved in the library too. Is that right, Mark?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Winslow, who basically co-invented the Spanish colonial Bible style at the San Diego World's Fair in 1915, he in 1930, I think 29, whatever, designed the current Presbyterian church, and he, at the time, Thatcher School said, hey, well, let's get him to do another library. So he did the library that attaches to the Arthur Benton original Spanish-style building that's at Thatcher, and he had already, I think he got the job because the Libby estate had hired him. Is that correct, Craig? Or someone associated had hired him to do the library, the original library, which was partly paid for by Libby.
You get that hacienda feeling with that particular bit.
Absolutely,
building.
very hacienda, before they built the
The
addition.
extensions off.
Well, you know, it's intriguing when you think about, you mentioned, you've all mentioned some of the craftsman buildings that Libby's house, Hunt and Gray, Green and Green. We haven't mentioned, but we could, the Julia Morgan house that is currently for sale, if anyone's got $9 million, with 31 additional acres, which is the Pierpont Gin House up on Thatcher Road. And these were all built before a stick of Spanish revival, mission revival was built in Ojai, because that was what you did. You know, if you were a rich guy from back east and coming to California in 1909, 1910. All those were 1908, 1909, 1909, 1910. And then Libby decided, I guess it was the logical thing to do. If you're going to remake the town in one style, let's do it Spanish style. Which leads me to, I guess, an interesting question. Is that overdone? I mean, what is it, 100 years later? It's 100 years last year since he started this. And, Topa Topa Winery partakes of the same style. Sunito, so much of the stuff that you've done. Is Ojai well served by this continuing to be faithful to this, or is it possibly time to maybe branch out? I put it to you, gentlemen. Ross.
It's a tricky question. I think.
Thank you.
I think the quality of the arcade, the bell tower, and the pergola. To me, they really form. It's a stage set, and it's been a stage set from the beginning. And I don't mean that to have a tinge of negativity at all, because I think. Rome is a stage set, for God's sake. And what happens is people become sort of actors, unwittingly, perhaps. But it's a very coherent group of buildings that complement each other and are effective in, and here's another word I swore I wouldn't use, but in branding Ojai, which is really what they were all about. Whether or not that needs to be a style that continues to sort of populate Ojai, I don't think so. I think that there are ways that style, Spanish style, can influence more contemporary designs. One example, I think, is the Kaufman House, that Neutra did in Palm Springs, which is stark, horizontal, flat roof, steel and glass, a sort of archetypal modern building, was actually influenced by his visit to Chaco Canyon and the indigenous flat roof structures that were built in the desert. So he was able to take, a local vernacular and make a modern building in response to that. And I think it's interesting to sort of play that design game where there are vernacular influences that can begin to adjust, more contemporary thinking about architecture.
Mark, what do you think about the Spanish?
I think we need to honor legacy that Libby created, and continue on with that legacy. I think we have, like I mentioned before, a magical little village that we live in here, and we need to maintain that and increase its charm and grow on that. I think there's a lot of creative, us as architects, a lot of creative avenues that we can take within the Spanish style. There's a lot of different, like what you're doing at the brewery there, and there's a lot of little innuendos that you can bring in some modern and creative ideas. But I think we really need to stay the course of what Libby set out, and stay with the charm that we have in this village. I think there's a softness or a feminine quality that Ojai has that a lot of the modern architecture is absent of, and I think we just need to stay in that tone of architecture.
Steve?
So, I think there's a balance. There's always a balance question in what we mostly do in anything in life, and that's the general overarching principle. We got the downtown corridor, and you have to respect that this romantic idea that Libby brought here to Ojai when he came, that has forged a style and a look that we have become very familiar with, and which we're endeared to. So that goes back to this idea of respecting what we have, the legacy, as Mark put it. And I think that in so doing, it doesn't forego the opportunity to move in other directions as long as we respect that. How do I define that? Maybe there's limits, as we move further. I'm talking publicly right now, because when we get into residential, that's another thing. But as we move further from the city limits, Ojai has a rich history of agriculture, of ranching. These are all elements that have been here for well over 100 years, 200 years, that could really work within today's contemporary design by paying homage to it. Again, there's a balance to it. I think as far as the downtown corridor goes, we have to respect that as pretty much as it is and continue that thought.
So let's personalize the architecture thing here. I want to ask you guys, which is your personal favorite? I don't know if do we do overall, or maybe I'll do it by the three main styles. I mean, we've got everything except Art Deco. Craig, is there one Art Deco somewhere? Craig Walker. Pretty Art Deco. Well, we haven't got much, let's face it. No, I mean in the town. We have Ojai is kind of like a museum of every architectural style that's been big in Southern California since Southern California became populated, except, I think, Art Deco. I mean, you have Albert Martin, who co-designed LA City Hall, and who did what is now Ventura's City Hall. But when he came to Ojai, he did Villanova Prep, which is Spanish. He fitted in with the prevailing. Same thing, Robert Stacey Judd, at the exact same time, famous for Mayan Revival. He comes here and he does Crotona in the style that kind of went with the style that was Libby had just established. So, but nonetheless, especially away from the city center, when you look at residential and so forth, we have, I think, everything with the possible exception of Art Deco. There's a heavy representation of. So, let's just divide it in three: Spanish, widely defined, mission, whatever, craftsman, and mid-century modern. So, what is your favorite, personal favorite? I'm not saying most important. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Steve. Personal favorite building doesn't have to be the most important. Your personal favorite building in any of those styles or an overall, you pick.
Mark, this is sort of like, when someone asks you, who's your favorite kid? All right? And you want to know. So you're going to get a kind of an ambiguous answer, you know that. All right. You know, Spanish-wise, the mission revival, I mean, it's really hard to, I mentioned Carlton Winslow. I mean, the Presbyterian Church, I think, is pretty outstanding. The one name that hasn't come up yet, who I really respect, and you see some of his stuff around town, but maybe it's not so representative of where he's been and what he became, is Wallace Neff. I love Wallace Neff. I mean, I think he took this idea of the Spanish romantic idea that was brought to California and just took it to another level, you know. It was represented at one time at the Ojai Valley Inn in the lounge up there, which is no longer with us. But this guy was so innovative and just a certain grace about his designs that I just really fell in love with. So I esteem his work. You know, the craftsman, I have to revert back to the Pratt House, although I see, you know, I'm looking at, I guess, was it the Myron Hunt house? And I mean, there's so many fine examples, but that's kind of like, the Pratt House to me is like, makes me think about the Gamble House in Pasadena, if you're familiar with that. I mean, that's the big flagship of Green and Green, right? But this is maybe a little miniature version of that, or a smaller version of it, but it's there. The elements are there. And it's just, you know, it's magic. You know, it's magic. That said, you know, as we get into the contemporary architecture, what's behind me here, Neutra and, you know, Rodney's houses, this idea of the case studies and the history behind it and what it became and how it influenced architecture in such a big way today. I mean, they had a couple things going for them. They had still and they had wide glass expanses that they could do, which the former architects didn't to a great degree, right? And so now you're really starting to connect with the outside. And for me, it's about nature. If I was going to summarize everything, and that's what I get out of Rodney's house and Richard Neutra's place is that you know, just look behind us here. I mean, that's what that house is about. It's about that mountain. It's about looking through at the waterscape behind it and how it tells into the foothills behind us. It's genius. So
the Morehouse.
Yeah.
Okay. Good choice. Okay, Mark?
Yeah, I have similar favorites. Steve, Wallace Neff, I love his work. The original country club structure, which we knew growing up. They still have the little winding stair, which, you know, is one of his signature pieces. I was able to work on one of his houses out on the East End, on McNell Road, and got to experience, you know, his genius and his, you know, flair for the charm of that era. And again, I'm the craftsman. I have to say, you know, the Casablanca again. It's just so amazing that the attention to detail, you know, the beamwork connections, the metal connections, and you know, the light fixtures. And they have this amazing stained glass, you know, really delicate detailing just in the light fixtures. And I had the privilege of, when I was in college, they showed me this house in our history books, and I was like, oh my God, that's in my town. And so my college break, I went up and knocked on the door, and there was this old couple who was living there, and they let me in and they let me walk around, and had the original furniture, which I guess they sold off when they sold it.
Designed by Green and Green, right?
Yeah,
they designed everything in those
right,
houses.
It was the original desks and.
If only we had those pieces now.
Yeah. And as far as contemporary, I actually am working right now on the Francis residence, not so much on the residence, but on the
Willard Hall. Francis?
Yeah.
What are you doing there?
We're doing a guest house on the property, and so the owners are wanting me to kind of imitate or use a lot of the ideas and details of that house in their guest house, and so I'm really becoming a student of that house, and it really is amazing. He kind of mixed these two Frank Lloyd Wright styles, the prairie style and the Taliesin style. I don't know if you know those two kind of genres that he was part of, and he kind of mixed those two together and did some of his own. But again, attention to detailing. He had these soffit light fixtures like Frank Lloyd Wright would do, and material going inside to the outside, kind of like Neutra's houses, and the spaces flow out to the views, and that indoor-outdoor flow that is so amazing. And so,
I'd point out that according to Craig's book, Frank Lloyd Wright himself gave his seal of approval of that house by in some sense putting rocks in a pile, or anyway, whatever. He was there. He said, "It is good." Okay, Ross.
Again, I'll try not to repeat what some of the other choices have been, because I agree with most of them. In the sort of Spanish-influenced style, the Austin Pierpont Libby Stables, I think, is incredible. The Paul Williams Ford Estate, which is right there, which I think is a great example of essentially making a modern building in a Spanish-influenced style, because there's a lot of sort of modernity that's happening there, which I think is interesting to play both of those notes off of each other. And it's also starting to make outdoor rooms, which I think is becomes part of what sort of California residential architecture is all about. If not connecting to sort of the immediate site, trying to connect to the larger landscape, which I think the more modern buildings do, with the large expanses of glass. The Craftsman Casa Barranca, incredible. Again, it's you can't sort of find better examples of that really anywhere. And then the more modern stuff. Modernism has been around so long, it's like 80 or 90 years, that it's really become part of the vernacular.
History now.
It's history. So it's interesting. We all talk about the vernacular as being a source of inspiration, whether it's, and I agree with your comments about, because it's sort of one of my favorite building types, are the agricultural sheds that happen in certainly in the Ojai and in a lot of agricultural areas in California. Whether it's a barn, a storage shed, there's a simplicity to it that, in fact, influenced Charles Moore and Bill Turnbull when they first designed Sea Ranch. So that ability to take local vernacular influences and styles and develop it into a modern response using those influences is certainly what I try to do in my own work. But I also think it's something that's happened in Ojai sort of over and over again. And again, I'd have to say the Neutra house, of course, is a great example of classic high modern architecture. What's sort of less apparent is, I'm pretty sure it's in the book, the Harwell Hamilton Harris, the Weil House, yeah, which is a great, it's a great blending of craftsman and modern, and I think that's. I think it's pretty cool to be able to have the skill and confidence to play both of those languages off of each other. And it's craftsmen with, again, large expanses of glass, beginning to create outdoor rooms and also providing amazing views to this, remarkable landscape that we live in.
Let me ask you, and you can continue, and then we'll go down the line. Specifically, and you've all talked in your, because I've read all your websites, I do my due diligence, reconciling nature and the built environment. You all emphasize that. Maybe it's what all architects do, I don't know. But this particular environment that we live in, how, in your view, and whether you want to talk personally or as you see all these architects, all these different styles, all these greats over the course of a century, is there a consistent way in which the particular Ojai environment has an impact on the built environment, whoever designs it? Keep going. And we'll go.
Yeah, shade. I think it's one reason the arcade is so successful is that it makes shade and provides shelter, and it's also a great filter between the street and the actual, commercial buildings behind it. So I think almost, in particular, some of the Craftsman buildings, they are inside actually quite dim. The materials tend to be dark wood. The windows, although they're plentiful, tend to be pretty small. And I think that's a response at that time to what really is not a benign landscape that we live in, or climate. It's pretty extreme in terms of temperature and, in this case, high temperatures and drought and dust and the idea and fire, dare I say, and the ability to sort of live in a much more filtered environment in those Craftsman houses, I think is a direct response to the amount of sunshine and heat and eventually, I hope, rain that we get in Ojai.
Our climate is a major determinant in design. I think, like in the Green and Green examples, they picked up on the old hacienda style houses, of big, deep porches, and a lot of shade. But what they took was the house going from inside to outside. I think our living outside is a big part of living here in Ojai, and so having spaces that flow from the inside to outside, even to outdoor living rooms, which we do quite a bit of, is a big design determinant. And then the views are amazing vistas that we want to take advantage of such as the Neutra house here. You really take advantage of it, but we always want to orientate ourselves to the views and also our sun angles and our breezes and those kind of things.
So agree. One thought that as I was reviewing these projects was a lot of the clientele came from places other than California, starting with Libby, back east. Krishnamurti had a lot of influential people come to hear him and end up living here and building homes and things of that nature. And so I can imagine back in the day, they come to Ojai and it's February and they're having a bluebird day and they're out in short sleeve shirts and they're thinking, I want to live here. This is something very special. And I think that is the common thread that runs through most of these projects that we're looking at here, is the ability to relate to the outdoors so much of the year, virtually all year long. We have the opportunity to do that with the shade factors, even now it's becoming even more accessible. So to me, that really is the inspiration that drives so much of the design that we have, and it, you know, going back to historic Spanish architecture, the thickened adobe walls, you know, the water fountain, the water feature out in the courtyard. It just might be a psychological thing, but there's some water running, you know. So it's these type of ideas that blend so well with our environment and our climate here, which makes it such a great place to live.
So I kind of let's see if we can get a little edgy here, up to a point. I'm going to ask you, and all these architects are long gone. No feelings will be hurt. Which of these many iconic buildings, we celebrate them all hugely. What's we've talked about the great ones, the ones you especially like. Anyone that you think, I wouldn't say bad, of course, but maybe a little overrated, a little bit not so much your favorite? Thank you, Ross. Thank God. It better not be the building we're sitting in.
Well, we all obviously share the love for Wallace Neff and what he was able to do. And the most overrated...
Mike.
Oh, sorry.
Wallace Neff, he said.
We love Wallace Neff. The most overrated building in Ojai. I went to the website of the Ojai Valley Inn, and there was a little commentary about the new Wallace Neff Heritage Bar, which is they refer to as the most famous room in Ojai. I would add was to that. I think the Ojai Valley Inn, when it was constructed initially, and Wallace Neff was involved, and it was a series of cottages and the main clubhouse, and Wallace Neff was everywhere. It was a really coherent response to program and site and the sort of magic that he was able to create, which has been completely obliterated. The Wallace Neff Heritage Lounge I went there once and vowed never to go back, because it's such a sad loss of what was there.
Even on half-price Thursdays?
Even on half-price Thursdays, exactly. And it sort of continues with even the arrival sequence. Now you drive into this kind of Las Vegas merry-go-round. The Crown family, are there any representatives of the Crown family here?
Alex, Kim, you're not here, are you? I think we're good. Go ahead.
I think they lost. Somebody needed to carry the torch there for the voice of Wallace Neff and what used to be, and no one did. And it's a sad. I hate it when things get erased, and especially things of value, like when the bowling alley gets erased. That'll be fine. I think
Mark's working
you're
on
taking
that.
care of that, right? Yeah. So there's some erasures that I'm all in favor of, but when something good disappears, it's a sort of a tragedy, and I think that's one of the local tragedies that has occurred.
Amen.
There we go.
Mark?
I don't know what Craig was thinking with the Matilaha gym. The Matilaha gym's in the book, and I was a little confused about that. Maybe
The whole school's in the book.
Well, yeah, the whole school. The rest of the campus is beautiful, but the gym is, I don't know. I disagree with that one. And the bowling alley, yeah, that's not in there, but I'm working on that, and we hope to. And actually, I want to go back to the comment about the downtown and the Spanish. We are actually doing an agrarian kind of taking the barn kind of style, and remember the Sunkist packing house that was at the end of the railroad tracks at the time. We're taking that vernacular and using that for the architecture there.
Of what?
Of the new design.
For
We're proposing
the bowling alley.
restaurant and brewery.
The bowling alley.
The bowling alley.
Yeah, okay. How does that stand, by the way? Is it?
We're in the city process right now.
Yes, well, enough said. Steve?
So, I really don't know how to answer this question. I was thinking more of not so much of these projects here, but something I'd like to see, I would have liked to see done differently.
We'll take that. Go ahead.
You want to go with that? So as you come into the Y there was a great opportunity at the Ford dealership to do something pretty spectacular at one time, right? And it's really the entrance to our downtown community. And I think they missed the boat there. You have basically a solid wall garage block and some sort of octagonal showroom, which works, I guess, for a car, dealership. But it would have been so nice to see something that paid more respect to our heritage and what our community is about. And I think they missed it there.
What is now going to be Boku?
That would be Boku now.
Because you're not obviously talking about the other car dealership, which you yourself turned into Topa Mountain
that
Winery.
project?
Okay, so the
Yeah,
one
no,
that's
I'm talking about the Boku.
closer to the Y.
I think it's it was an opportunity, a missed opportunity.
Yeah, they haven't done anything to it, really. It's just
No, I mean, they've done their best. I think they tried to cosmetically do some faux painting on the sides and,
Yeah.
dress it up what they could do, but it is what it is.
it is what it is. Okay, what follow up on that? There may not be an answer to this, but are there any buildings or architects that local or represented here that should have been in the book or in the exhibit? Of course, we only had 80 pages, but nonetheless, what may have unjustly been left out, or if you had your druthers, what that is not celebrated in this exhibit or in the book, do you think is worthy of that we can now give it its due, or that architect his or her due? Steve, why don't you continue?
Sure. I mean, there's so many projects, great projects out here that there would never be a book big enough, I'm sure. But one architect that I really come to admire is Thornton Ladd, who was in the Pasadena area for many, many years. He's has some great civic projects, the Norton Simon Museum, that sort of thing. But he built a house for himself, a retirement house up in Upper Ojai. And I had the experience of going up and checking it out, and it's secluded up on a hill, and you can't see it from anywhere except for the property. But the landscaping, the attention to views, similar to what's behind me, very impressive. And I considered him pretty much a landmark type of architect. Thornton Ladd.
LADD.
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. All right.
Did I get that right, Craig? Do you know? Okay.
Did that building you always see in the Rose Parade, the
Yeah, that's
bank
Norton Simon
that's in the
Museum.
background?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he probably just made the cutoff. We had 80 pages. Anyway, but good call. Mark.
I guess Steve Foster's not dead, but he did a great job on the Sunito Inn. I really like that building. I don't know who the architect was. The El Toro house that was just recently remodeled, and they've been having open houses there.
El Toro?
El Toro, they call it the El Toro house. You know what the house I'm talking about? On top of the hill above.
Is that the one that's like the multi
La Cañada.
modernist?
No, it's a mission style home. And there's that. I don't know the architect. There's that quaint little tower residence on the top of Farnham Road.
I always wonder who the heck made that.
Isn't that a beautiful
it's like
little
three
piece?
different towers and they don't match from a distance.
I've always loved that place up there,
Yeah.
and so
We'll have to make a point for the next book.
right.
We have to find out who. If anyone knows who that is, come up afterwards. Ross.
There are two houses by Chalfont Head
Oh, he barely made the missed. He barely missed.
on Carn.
Carn?
Yep.
Okay.
And others I'm sure that I don't know about. But those two in particular are just a nice, again, a modern response to a house on the road. I mean, you really don't see them because they're sort of obscured by a really well-done masonry wall, and then the house sort of falls off behind that. Those are two great ones. An architect who I really don't know much about, but I love the house, is Kasumi Adachi.
Yeah,
The
also
house
we looked at that.
on McNell,
Yeah, yeah.
but there wasn't enough room probably for that.
Oh, no, the book was 80 pages, and the room is the room.
But that was done by
Believe me, Craig would have done 200 pages.
Yeah, that was recently remodeled by Marmol and Radsner.
Oh, was it?
Yeah,
Oh,
so
okay.
it's really it's actually a great house. Although I wouldn't have expected it to be in the book. The perpetually for sale structure on Ojai Avenue, with the deep lot behind it. It's also concrete block and really
the old tool.
it was before my time. I guess it was an old tool shed or something.
Well, that was a manufacturer,
Yeah,
wasn't it?
but it's
Welding.
Yeah.
it is one of my favorite buildings because its relationship to the street, I think, is incredibly successful. And it's also a building type that gets into the whole vernacular that we've talked about, which is it a barn, is it a shed, is it a utility building? Well, it's sort of all of those things. And because of that kind of flexibility, it has a non-specific quality where it could be a florist shop, a barber shop, a bar, a restaurant,
It was going
a
to
welding
be,
shop.
It was going to be a
brewery.
A brewery.
Right.
but No, it's not.
So anyway, I admire its proportions and its simplicity and its sort of authenticity and honesty. And I guess it's overpriced, or there's a toxic waste dump behind
So
it or
it
something.
seems.
And then, because we're sort of bleeding into overlooked buildings,
Yes,
right?
you bet.
And one that is, will always haunt me because I spent time in it, was the Rough House at the Thatcher School. And you probably don't know about it. It was demolished in 1973, I think. Sherman Day Thatcher was the architect. And it was basically people talk, modernists, architects have always talked about the house as being a machine for living. Well, this was a machine for death and destruction. It was a wooden barn. I'll try to describe it, but there are pictures. I know you can find them online. It was a wooden barn that had ramps and ropes and ladders and a sawdust floor and ladders and ramps and ropes on the outside of the building as well as the inside. The roof was usable. And it was basically a contraption, a great wooden contraption that was built to accommodate teenage boys and the fact that they needed a place to, rather than destroy the dorms they lived in, work off some steam in what was known as the Rough House. It, too, was a Western barn, sort of vernacular building. It had all these sort of modern components to it, though. And again, it had this multi-purpose aspect where it wasn't just about kids attempting to kill themselves or hurt each other, but it was also it was a theater, it was a place for banquets, it was for poetry reading, so it had this multifaceted component in addition to being just an outlet for teenage boy energy. It was a gymnasium. It was.
It's gone?
It's gone because there were enough injuries that occurred there.
Lawyers.
That the potential for lawsuits was coming up, and it just was never going to conform to any Ventura County codes at all.
Nothing conforms.
No, but
to Ventura County
it was a
code.
fabulous building, and it's actually still. So it's been gone for 40 years, 45 years now. It still comes up in conversations at Thatcher in particular to the new computer and design building that's being proposed. They refer to it now as a rough house for the mind. So it's interesting that even in its absence, it still has this incredible power and this memory. And it is worth looking up online because it's really it's a fantastic building and deserves to be remembered.
Speaking of Thatcher, some of the more preservationist-minded of us were, I think, pleased. Anyway, I was when Thatcher decided, after quite a bit of back and forth, to not replace the old dining hall, but to build a new one somewhere else, because you could make a strong argument, as many did, that this is the building that goes back to the 1890s, right? I mean, that's where Thornton Wilder. Anyway, so I guess that's going to be changed, but preserved in some sense. So, because getting rid of stuff, that's not no famous architect designed that building. It isn't beautiful. I mean, it's not ugly, but it's just a building. But God, why get rid of it? It's a wonderful thing to have. Anyway, I've got more questions, but I tell you what, let's open it up to the floor because it's 20 minutes to 6, and see if anyone else has some questions. And there's one right there. Is that Amy? Huh. Hi, Amy.
I like that you referenced indigenous elements and, like a little longer in history than just when Libby was here. But when you went to design your own house, what were your inspirations?
It was a 1906, probably a ranch manager's house. It was more of a shack than a house, really, which I liked. It had no insulation. It had no, it had the standard Ojai foundation detail, which was a 4x4 coming down to a rock. But what's interesting about that is it's been through however number of earthquakes have occurred. Buildings like that tend to just wiggle and they're fine. That's not the way Ventura County looks at it. I was able to call it a remodel, even though the only thing left standing was the fireplace and chimney and a old circuit board, electrical panel, because there wasn't anything that was really could be saved and still get a building permit. So I tried to eliminate the number of rooms that were in it. I kept the footprint very much the same. I hollowed out and raised the ridge so there was a much more interior volume inside, and then clipped a front porch onto it, which again was my shade making device because it had a western exposure. And I continued that language with roll down canvas blinds, meaning 13 feet wide, 12 feet high times 4. So there are 4 canvas panels that drop down and sort of kill that late afternoon western light. But also, because I used a lot of nautical hardware on it, they are like 4 great sails, and there's ways to tighten them up and tie them down at the bottom so that porch then becomes essentially an outdoor room at night in the wintertime when it's raining and windy. It's really kind of great. So I tried to, again, sort of look both ways, remind myself that this used to be a little shack, which I liked, and also bring it forward using more modern materials. We used some fiberglass panels inside to let light sort of transmit from room to room and through a skylight that sort of, it begins to function almost like a Japanese sort of paper lantern in the daytime and at night. We played with the roof line in a way that made it a little more aggressive and not so humble. So it was sort of a small house trying to flex its muscles a little bit and pretend that it was a bigger house than it was. But that outdoor clipped-on porch, when all the other doors are open to it, it's that kind of example that we've all been trying to make of architecture that incorporates outdoor spaces, and this sort of mediates between inside and outside. And I guess just one quote from Bill Turnbull, my old boss, who worked with Charles Moore, who's got the Krishnamurti thing back behind there. One of his sort of descriptions of California architecture, residential architecture, was basically the house should be as small as it can possibly be. It's just a place to keep your stuff because you're actually living outside. And we tried to sort of take that forward.
Another question? Yes, sir.
My question, I guess, is more general, but is there now a kind of coherent postmodern style of architecture, a school? If there is there an example of that style in Ojai?
Steve, how'd you take that?
I really couldn't answer that. You're talking about within our community itself, or a school of architecture?
Something postmodern.
Yeah.
Modern is from like 1940.
Oh, okay.
So is there a school of architecture post that now that we think of that's coherent?
Well, I think that kind of reflects, a way I would interpret that is look like to Charles Moore. He would take, he wasn't a modernist. In fact, I think in reading the book, I actually learned something about it, that he was kind of how can I explain it? Less rigorous about the hardness of modern architecture, the square corners and things like that. He was a lot more whimsical, and it worked, and he was able to play, my understanding, bring postmodern architecture into play. And in so doing, you can see a lot of eclecticism in his work. You'll see tiled floors. I like the whimsical trusses, and he's playful. And if you even look at his drawings, it's pretty fun. It's pretty fun stuff. The guy was quite an artist. So I don't know if that answers your question about postmodern architecture or not, but.
Mark, you want to take a whack at it?
I don't know anything about postmodern architecture.
We're sort of beyond postmodern. Postmodern was a horrible style that happened 20 years ago. And I think this sort of evaporated on its own. But currently, and this is my own sort of pet peeve, is most of the people that come and work for me out of school, they're all rock stars when it comes to designing with computers. I mean, they're extremely talented, which means I don't have to be. But none of them can draw. Like, you put a pencil in their hands and they look, it's deer in the headlights time. They really don't know what to do with it. And I think the result is that a lot of current design that's coming out of schools and being practiced as well is the result of design being where the computer is brought into the design process much too early. So things look figured out when they're not. And there's something about drawing with a pencil, your uncertainties get telegraphed through the mind, eye, hand, pencil, paper thing, where when it's done on a computer and you're looking at images where everything is line weights are consistent, everything looks figured out, when it's not. So things tend to get frozen too soon in a design process. That's one thing. The other thing is now these curved, warped shapes are are possible. You can not only draw them, but you can build them, which there are, if you look at any sort of architecture magazine, over the last 10 years or so, a lot of the buildings start looking like bicycle helmets, which is it's why cars look so horrible too. But they're, aggressive warped shapes that look as if they sort of fell from the sky. They have very little often to do with responding to local site conditions. And it's sort of I don't know how it's starting to kind of wind down a little bit. I think people realize that the result is not particularly harmonious. It's all, a lot of these structures are really standalone. They'll always be standalone buildings and have very little to do with context. But I could be a dinosaur, so I don't, that's just my own personal feeling.
We all are, ultimately. Tony?
I just wanted to ask Mark about his house, which I found very interesting, and certainly has elements of doggy.
Yes.
And I wonder whether you conceptualize it all at once or conceptualize it as you were going along building it.
Well, we started with a cabin that was built in the 30s. It was like a hunting lodge, had no power or had some running water with a wood-burning hot water heater when we moved in, and so we brought in the septic systems and things like that. But so I had that cabin sort of vernacular just to begin with, and I decided to use that as the sort of an umbrella to be creative with what I like to do. My wife was very generous in allowing me to kind of do my thing there, was to use the plaster shapes similar to Gaudí, which was a big, one of my heroes, architects. Use his philosophy of taking nature shapes and taking things in nature and creating art with it. And so I took these plaster shapes, and we used a tree that we built the house around, and used the tree shapes to create our pillars and window shapes, and kind of created this Art Nouveau sort of sculpted space with the cabin roof line, similar to like a Craftsman style roof line on top of it.
Thank you, Mark. I have another question. No hand at the moment. Oh, Brian?
So a question, I'll put this to Steve. The value, the importance of preservation, kind of a self-serving question.
Says the chairman of the Historic Preservation Commission. Thank you, Brian.
I think it goes back to the idea of respecting our legacy, our past, and we have to, and I think the Historic Preservation Committee does a pretty good job of reviewing the projects as they come through. And I would say that, in my own experience with this, it's a difficult process because a lot of these buildings that we're given to remodel or bring up to date because they're old and maybe a change of use, that sort of thing, can have been already modified, let's say, from the original context of the building. So it gets into a gray area. Obviously we need to preserve our history here, but what are those limits, I guess, is the question. And I think it's a process that we learn as we go. Sometimes it just takes delving into a particular project to find out what is it about, what is the history of that particular building, and trying to work through the channels to move that can be somewhat onerous, right? As someone who, as a builder or an architect or perhaps our client. but it's part of the world we live in. You know, I accept it. It is there, and I just look for equanimity in all these types of things. I don't like seeing extremes, if that makes sense to you, in terms of, you know, judgment calls from people or positions of authority that maybe need more information. It's a slippery slope, but it's necessary. So I think we got to find the balance in all that.
I'd point out that Steve's firm did the Twice Sold Tales renovation, which resulted in a restoration of the outside front of the building in a way that it was as in Libby's day when it was his real estate office, but the inside was repurposed for modern needs. Right.
Right. We kept the facade, and
You restored
we
it,
had a
in
photograph, you know, from 1926 that we worked off of, and did our best to replicate that and maintain, you know, keep the elements that we thought were original to the facade. There's some beautiful tile work there. But once we got beyond that facade, which was termited out and rotted, they had to actually rebuild quite a bit of it. We were able to get in there and bring things up to date and make it considerably more useful for them.
Well, and since we're approaching 6, and I have a question that it sort of flows from since we mentioned Libby. One of you, actually was Mark, I think, on your website, had the Churchill quote, "We shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us." Well, you three gentlemen, this is sort of going back over some of what we've talked about, but in Ojai in particular, all these great architects over the years, I mean, we have great architects now, but we're talking. Well, we have some live ones. Thank you very much for being here. But yeah. Oh, there is the point of view that we have this unusually built environments dense with jewels, and certainly dense with the many architects that have been bloomed large in Southern California. So the question is, again, like Churchill said, what do you think? And Libby, as we know, as Craig wrote in his book, sought to have architecture create a better community. He really thought, he believed, he wasn't an architect, but he had the whole City Beautiful movement thing, and he believed it. And he tried to do that, and I guess the question is to you guys, to what extent has that worked, if at all, in Ojai? With the architecture as a tool to create, a healthy community. Mark.
I think Libby's experiment worked. I think the community of Ojai and the people here, we're such a unique community of giving, thoughtful, generous people who are always going out of their way to, promote projects and helping out the schools. We are really a community of really unique community, and I think a lot of it has to do with our architecture and our village that Libby created. And so, in that sense, I think his thought or philosophy was correct, and that's why I'm here today, and we help support this exhibit. As I think architecture is undervalued in our society, and if we put more of our energies as a society, into rebuilding our cities and creating beautiful spaces such as we have in the rest of the country, what a different place our country, our world would be.
Ross.
I was just sort of struck by this exhibit, which I think is really well done. There are various and many sort of styles represented here, and yet they're all Ojai buildings. I think that's sort of worth noting, that there are all kinds of responses, varied responses to this valley and this landscape that are valid. And I guess the influences that sort of flying around for me We've talked about, the vernacular and barns and sheds and storage buildings, ranch houses, in addition to missions and Spanish-style buildings. I think all of those are sort of valid reference points to creating new architecture and new buildings in Ojai. And yet, how varied these all are, they still seem to be comfortable sort of with each other. They're not doing battle or stylistic battle. And I'll take it sort of one step further, which I'm sure everyone in this room hates those two round ammonia storage tanks that are in the Ventura River Basin heading towards...
The historic tanks?
The historic tanks, the ones they're probably gone already. I was sort of on a letter writing campaign to try to get them to be saved, because that's like another erasure that I didn't think should happen. And I guess that's true for the Ojai Valley in general. There are a lot of great old buildings that I hope manage to hang on to themselves in the course of events.
Here, here. Steve?
I think the experiment is working as well. The idea of community, Mark touched on, I think that's what we're all about. I think it's all about relationships, and I think good architecture fosters that. But we have to bear in mind that it's a process. We never arrive, and things are in a constant state of change. Our challenges are sustainability, the environmental concerns. All these types of things come into play when we're designing for our community, for ourselves, for each other. And it's what's doing what's right at the time. And as so doing that, it becomes an opportunity and a privilege to have some sort of impact and proactiveness in the process. And I think that's what I love about architecture, is the relationships, I think it ultimately comes down to people, and our buildings do have a great impact in shaping who we are as individuals. So.
Thanks. By the way, I should point out or thank Mark and Julia Whitman for co-sponsoring this exhibit, along with the Arts Commission, which we very much appreciate. It's 6 o'clock. Anybody have any other questions? We'll take it.
It's not a question, but it's a house that's amazing in Ojai, and it's not on the wall, and it's not in the book. And I was just wondering if you know about it. It's on McAndrew. It's adjacent to Thatcher, but not on the corner. It's back a ways. And it was built in 1906. And it was built by one of the first female architects in the United States. And it was commissioned for the Bormans as celebrating their engagement when him and his wife got together. It's a beautiful craftsman, wide plank, pure, unknotted,
What was the architect?
And I forget her name. It's
Greg, what do we know about this?
I just told him about it and said, where is it? It should be up, it should be in the book.
By Design, Volume 2. Look for it where books are sold.
It was on the cover. I had the listing and I sold it. It was on the cover of the Ojai Quarterly a few years ago.
Oh my goodness.
Just beautiful, and a whole article on it, and I'm just...
Was this one of the Mary Gray buildings? The Mary Gray, the 1906, that'd be too early for that. So 1906, that's could be Julia Morgan, but it's a little early for that. This we'll have to do further research.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you what issue, so...
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. We'll work on that. Speaking for the museum, we'll work on that. Anybody else have any other comments? In which case, Julie.
Architect is, and your favorite style.
That's a good
Since I haven't even thought of that, I have no question, no answer, Julie. I like them all. And every day is Children's Day. That's my answer. Craig.
I would just like to say that after doing this project of the book, and how much, and having grown up in the household with an architect, how important the architect is to the final product. It's not just the beauty of the house, but how the rooms relate to each other and how things flow in the house. It's really important to, if you're building a house, to get a good architect to help you design that.
Here's yay for architecture. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to our panelists. Don't forget, September 28th, Raymond Neutra will be right here in front of his father's house talking about Neutra and nature. So we'll hope to see you then. Thanks for coming.